Hello, everybody. I'm Anaji, and this is FMV Reviews. And today we're going to be talking about the new sci-fi thriller Voyagers. And we're going to be answering the question: is Voyagers more than just sexy Lord of the Flies in space? The answer is no. No, it's really not. I don't really have a whole lot positive to say about this movie, so I'm just going to give the positives right up front. So, one, I do think this movie, it doesn't look bad. It has a sort of glossy, Apple-esque sci-fi looks, but at the same time, it makes it where it's kind of sterile and generic. So it's a positive and a negative. I would also say this movie has some interesting, very few, but some interesting cinematography stuff in terms of like, it has these sort of interesting stop motion montage things and some psychedelic imagery it's playing with just a little bit, but it's not something that makes up a bulk of the movie, and it's not going to save the movie. So now that I've said those positive things, let's just get right into it. I think one of the big problems of Voyagers is that it really doesn't think past the premise. I can tell that I think the way this movie was pitched was, let's do Lord of the Flies in space, but also let's make it sexy. Right? But unfortunately, I think the writer and the director, I think his name is Neil Burgess. He is the writer and director of the film. And unfortunately, he didn't think past that, right? It's a good starting place, right? You know, Lord of the Flies is a literary classic. If you're American, you've went to any sort of school system, I'm sure you've had to read this book. So you know what I'm talking about, that it's solid material. But unfortunately, because he doesn't think past the premise, he doesn't find ways to add things to an already strong premise. So this kind of affects a bunch of things in the movie. So one of the things I want to talk about is the fact that I don't care about any of the characters really in this movie. They didn't do a very good job of fleshing the characters out. You really only have three main characters. You have Zach, who's the antagonist. You have Christopher, who's the protagonist, and then you have Zayla, I believe, and she's kind of she's a love object for the most part. I mean, she has some agency, but she's not a main character. She actually low-key might have been a more interesting main character, but then it wouldn't fit into the Hollywood. I'll get into it towards the end, but it doesn't fit into certain things. Yeah, the characters for the most part, they don't really have any characterization. They're very much just broad types, right? Like Christopher, he's the good boy character. He's trying to do the right thing. Zach, he's the bad boy character. Zayla, she's their love interest and whatnot, that she's something that they sort of compete over, and also a way to add sexual tension and whatnot. But even into a certain extent, none of the other characters really have any particular traits as well. Like Colin Farrell's in this movie, his character super bland. Yeah, I don't understand why they did that. And unfortunately, what it does to these characters a lot of times is it makes it where they just sort of seem like mouthpieces for themes of the movie of, politics where fear is used, or emotion overrides logic and whatnot. So it makes it where the themes are so naked in this movie that it doesn't make it very interesting. I also want to say, in terms of why I think this director not thinking past the premise is a problem, is that there's actually some pretty interesting existential material here, right? If I want to give a very brief synopsis, it's Earth is in a bad state. We found a planet that's habitable, but the journey is going to take about 87 years, right? So what they're going to do is they're going to send some really young kids who are made from a bunch of smart people's genes and whatnot. And those kids who are initially being launched into space, because the journey is so long, they're not even going to get to see the new planet. Their grandkids are going to really be the one who probably get to see that planet. So there's some interesting existential things, right? Where you have it where these kids are in space. They weren't really asked permission if they wanted to do this. They are robbed of a certain kind of life. And unfortunately, I wish the director had taken that into account, because like, let's take into account the villain, Zach, right? Because he's just kind of using the Lord of the Flies premise. Zach is just a naked villain, in the sense that his motivations are obviously evil, obviously selfish, but I think it would have made it more interesting, because there is some solid existential stuff going on if his character had said something like, hey man, They didn't ask us if we wanted to do this. They've been drugging us. And I think that's unfair. And I think that would have made it where, as an antagonist, he would have had a lot more solid ground and a lot more philosophical debate to have with their protagonist, Christopher, because it kind of does really become this thing of either you follow all the rules and do everything that's right, or you give into your emotions and your wants. And instead of doing an interesting thing of, well, why can't we have a little bit of both, right? And so it kind of creates this odd messaging. And I would say, in terms of that lack of characterization, that lack of human element, right? So when I bring up the plot point of these kids are being drugged, right? Obviously, humans were volatile when they send these kids into space, especially people who are going through their teenage years. They're drugging these kids, keeping them sedated so that way the mission will work. Their emotions won't override too hard. But there's a certain plot in the part in the movie where when they stop taking this substance, the acting is still very wooden. There's not much dynamic in the acting, which let me know, oh, this is not a director choice thing. You just didn't give these characters much character to be real. And yeah, unfortunately, it really makes it where this movie is pretty bland. You pretty much know where it's going from start one. You're not particularly invested. It does have some thriller elements, but unfortunately, because we're not clear on the geography of the ship and how close and far things are, it's not able to really deliver on those thriller elements. And it makes me want to get into, this is not something that necessarily, this doesn't help the movie, but this is not necessarily a huge knock. But I remember while watching the movie, I couldn't help but think of this observation someone made about, especially like American sci-fi movies, how American sci-fi movies tend to always have white protagonists at the forefront of it, right? And how it subtly sends a message to someone of color that when we are thinking of our future, people of color are included into it. The three main characters of this movie, no knock against them or anything, but they're all white. All of them are white, right? And it just kind of sends this message of, okay, the only three characters of interest who have any agency or any substance on the plot are all white. And it kind of sends this message of they're the only ones who matter, which sucks because there is a multiracial cast, and there's Asian, there's Black, there's Latino, there's, East Asian, you know what I mean? But all those characters are in the background, and all those characters are given little to no characterization. And I couldn't help but wonder why they didn't take some chances with this movie to make it more interesting. Why don't you get into some of the racial stuff and whatnot? But so with that, I will say that Voyagers, unfortunately, has wasted sci-fi potential and can't really think past its premise. And so for that, I'm going to give Voyagers a 6 out of 10. If you saw this movie, let me know what you think down in the comments below. And if you like this review, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. So I'll talk to y'all later. Bye.